Well, that wasn't what I wanted to do. That's better. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. And Cameron already preempted the show with, in today's edition of the 10th Amendment may actually be the most important of them all. Yes. So we're going to talk about Army Sergeant Daniel Perry this morning and what has happened and what is happening with that particular case. And, you know, you can be forgiven, guys, if you just heard about this guy, because, surprise, surprise, he didn't make a lot of news headlines while his trial was ongoing. Not like Rittenhouse or Chauvin. So with Rittenhouse and Chauvin, they both got massive news coverage. And in the Chauvin case, that news coverage worked in favor of the prosecution. The politically motivated, highly biased, corrupted prosecution. And Chauvin was convicted. Chauvin was convicted of the murder of a man who, by all accounts from the medical examiners, functionally committed suicide before the police encounter began, which is to say that his system contained enough fentanyl to be fatal, right? So in the Chauvin case, now, what you saw in the Chauvin case, I think that Chauvin may have been a little overzealous in the way that he treated I forget his St. Michael of fentanyl. But in that particular case, it looked very much like George Floyd. That's it. It looked very much like Floyd not only ingested enough fentanyl to kill a horse, but then went on to assault the police while they were trying to arrest him in what appears to legitimately have been the commission of a crime. On this show, we have been highly critical in the past, and will continue to be in the future, I'm sure, of police who are not competent to do their job. There is a lot to criticize the police on. There really is. We are not a bootlicking organization over here, but the police serve a necessary function, at least in theory, which is to say there is a huge amount of room for reform in law enforcement. And personally, I believe a lot of that reform should begin with the abolition of the FBI and some very serious changes to things like the qualified immunity, stuff like that. Now, that said, let's get to the story of Daniel Perry. So the basic story, what happened with Daniel Perry is apparently he was an Uber driver at the time. So former Army sergeant, he's out. Guys, I've been a former Army sergeant who was driving for Uber. And please believe I never, ever cranked the car to go drive for Uber or Lyft without that I was wearing a pistol, because I did it in Atlanta. And yes, Atlanta is an unsafe community. Atlanta is an unsafe community precisely because it contains the sort of people who will support BLM. Notice I didn't say because there are black people in Atlanta, because I want you to understand this. This is important, right? There's a lot of criticism that can be leveled at certain black cultural tropes, but when you're talking about Black Lives Matter, the organization, your greatest threat among them are radical leftist terrorists. And that's what they are. They are terrorists. So this case is being tried at a time when the Summer of Love is pretty well in our rearview mirror. It is not current and ongoing, but the incident occurred during this Summer of Love. So at a time when Black Lives Matter, the organization, and Antifa, the organization, had organized, funded, coordinated, and conducted massive terror attacks across the entire country, and those attacks were ongoing, resulting in billions of dollars of property damage from direct attacks using incendiary and explosive devices crafted by members of BLM and Antifa in support of the Democrat agenda, and killed dozens of people in broad daylight with no repercussions. At a time when that was going on, this Uber driver turned a corner and found himself surrounded by a protest. A protest being conducted by an organization who publicly in the U.S. headlines in the news was known to have murdered people in the streets. And when I say murdered people in the streets, we've got ample video of things like a group of BLM protesters surrounding tractor trailers, dragging the driver out of the cab and beating and or murdering them. There were only 2 or 3 occasions where they actually dragged the driver out of the car, out of the truck, and straight murdered him, actually killed him. But there were many, many events where they pulled him out and beat them mercilessly. We've seen video of BLM protesters smashing their way into restaurants, like, you know, coming through the front door in huge crowds, smashing windows on the way in, and then assaulting and injuring people in that group. So this former Army sergeant turns a corner driving for Uber in Austin, Texas, finds himself surrounded by a mob of vocally, avowedly violent people. And we're talking about an organization that has been, right, after all the January 6th crap, and Donald Trump incited those riots with his violent rhetoric. And they have to go through things that Trump said and assume intent and pretend like it's violent rhetoric. While at the same time, we can look at statements from AOC, from Kamala Harris, from the rest of the squad, from most Democrats that you can name off the top of your head, where they have said explicitly that there should be more violence. These people need to do more violence. They need to protest more, get out in the streets. If you see a Trump supporter out in public, you get in their face and tell them they're not welcome here, right? So that's what we saw. We saw a massive terrorist organization conduct not an actual insurrection. No. Multiple actual insurrections, right? J6 gets referred to as an insurrection when some protesters went into a public building, escorted by police officers, invited in, ushered into the building. We don't hear the word insurrection from the other side of the aisle, referring to BLM organizers, protesters, rioters, terrorists who set up autonomous zones where they physically took control of U.S. territory and used violence and intimidation tactics to deny access to that territory to the government. That is what an insurrection looks like. That is what the conduct of war looks like. Taking territory and holding it. War is won only when a soldier holds ground and denies access through use of violence. That is the conduct of war. So, Sergeant Perry was faced by a crowd of people who were engaged in the conduct of war against the United States of America, an activity against which he personally swore an oath to uphold and defend the Constitution of the United States of America against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And let me tell you something. You may stop following the orders of the officers appointed above you when you ETS, when you end your time in service with the U.S. military. But I and many of us, soldiers, we take that oath to uphold and defend the Constitution of the United States of America from all enemies, foreign and domestic, very seriously. That's why we swore it to begin with. And here he is faced with a group of terrorists conducting war against the United States and the Constitution. And one of them approached him and aimed an AK-47 at him, and he had the correct and natural response. He returned fire and eliminated the threat. He, quite rightly, engaged with and destroyed a threat to the United States and her Constitution. What Daniel Perry did was absolutely the correct thing to do. Let's assume for a moment that the value of that oath is not, it should not be a factor in this case, which I argue it absolutely should be. But let's assume for a moment, for the sake of argument, that it should not be. And what you see is a man who lives in America, while all of the news is reporting that BLM and Antifa are murdering people in the streets, causing massive property damage. We're seeing other instances where the crowds, where the large hordes of BLM violent terrorists with a history of conducting actual serious violence, even up to and including throwing incendiary devices at federal properties, without any concern for the consequences of those actions. And he is faced with that mob pointing a weapon at him. And his defense of self-defense against the charge of murder has been dismissed. He's been charged with murder. Murder, not negligent homicide, not manslaughter, but murder. The argument being put forth by the prosecution that this man, who was wearing a t-shirt, shorts, and flip-flops with premeditation of purpose, went to an armed crowd and chose a man armed with a rifle and dressed in body armor and combat gear to kill that man intentionally. We're expected to believe that this sergeant, this Army veteran, who has been trained in the conduct of war, the use and carry of combat equipment, has been trained to wear body armor and execute engagement against the enemy, went in board shorts and a t-shirt and flip-flops with the intent of murdering someone. Because intent is an incredibly important element of the crime of murder. Steve Rodemeyer asks, how did they prove intent in court? They went to his Twitter feed and they found a racially insensitive joke. That's how they proved intent. It's very much like the case of the McMichaels in Georgia, where even after, a half dozen prosecutors said this is a legitimate case of self-defense, and they finally found a corrupt prosecutor to come in and take over. They found one of the McMichaels using the N-word on Twitter once or twice, and then after the defense presented their argument, their self-defense claims, the judge ordered the jury to ignore those claims. Now, remember, in this case, just like in the McMichael case, where we're talking about the infection of a corrupt prosecutor and a corrupt judge, right? I mean, that judge was clearly corrupted. The judge in the McMichael case, he was clearly corrupted. He sat there and let the defense make their arguments, and then he instructed the jury to interpret the law in a way that the law has never been interpreted, and instructed them with that information in mind, then to dismiss, to ignore, to vitiate the argument of the defense. And, of course, part of the defense's argument entailed the McMichaels explaining what happened that day. which, without the argument of self-defense, was the same as confessing to murder. The McMichaels were entrapped by a corrupt prosecution and a corrupt judge. The same thing's happening here, because remember, we're talking about a DA in Austin, Texas. We've talked many times on this show about how it's a bad idea to do stupid stuff in Texas because it's a good way to get yourself shot. Austin is the blue cancer in Texas. Austin, Texas may as well be Los Angeles or San Francisco. It's a very blue city. And so basically what you've got is they have decided that this man's got to go down. It gets worse. Remember back to the Rittenhouse case. One of the factors that we discussed a lot in the Rittenhouse case is there was an incredible amount of serious exculpatory evidence, which the FBI and the prosecutor, Little Binger, they got caught. They got caught intentionally suppressing exculpatory evidence that eventually made the Rittenhouse case for him, and got Rittenhouse his acquittal. Right there was video evidence that was explicitly altered by the FBI. There were testimonies. There was other evidence that was simply withheld. And they cited things like, it's related to other ongoing investigations, things of that nature. There was serious exculpatory evidence that was withheld. In this case, there was exculpatory evidence that was withheld from the grand jury in the course of the indictment, and it was withheld by the judge's argument. I shit you not. The judge in this case made the argument that the exculpatory evidence available during the conversation with the grand jury was not necessary because the Constitution doesn't explicitly require the exculpatory evidence to be provided to the grand jury. Now, one of the things that got Binger in trouble is discovery. You are required, as the prosecutor, if exculpatory evidence comes into your possession, you are required to supply that to the defense in discovery. The judge in this case actually argued that the exculpatory evidence was not forced by law to be provided to the grand jury. So the judge in this case is corrupt. The judge in this case decided that he wanted to attack an agent of his political opposition by withholding the exculpatory evidence intentionally. And yes, I am ascribing intent to the judge, not just the prosecutor, judge. Remember, we're talking about Austin. Austin is nearly as guilty as San Francisco, New York, name your lefty city, of downgrading felony charges and taking a hands-off, catch and release attitude toward BLM terrorists. They, you burned down a federal courthouse. Well, don't get caught doing it again. Oh, you burned down the president's library, but, there's just so much other stuff that needs to be prosecuted right now. That's just not that important. We're going to need all those. We can't lock you up. We're going to need all those jail cells for the January 6th invasion that we've got planned for 6 months from now. So, obvious miscarriage of justice. And now what we're looking at, thankfully, Governor Abbott, and this is where Cameron's comment comes in, that the 10th Amendment looks like it might be the most important amendment of them all. And I would actually say, I wish that the 10th Amendment were third. I wish that the Third Amendment were the 10th Amendment, not the whole bivouac thing. But Abbott has come in and said he's going to pardon Sergeant Perry. He doesn't actually have the authority directly to pardon Perry. That's true. He can't just say, Omni Domini, get out of jail. There's a board. Abbott appoints people to the board of pardons, petitions that board to recommend a pardon, and then once the board recommends the pardon, Perry can go ahead with the pardon. There is certainly a chance that board gets populated with people who are friendly to the BLM. I think it's a slim chance, because if I understand it correctly, in Texas, the way it works is Perry actually appoints the people to the board, so I should hope that they go along with it, but we'll be looking at a pardon. Here's the thing, though. A pardon in this case is not justice. It's not. Now, I'm 100% on board pardon Perry, right? Vitiate this conviction, pardon him, and absolutely clear his entire record. He should not be treated like a criminal, because all of the evidence that we have says that if he had not fired in self-defense while surrounded by BLM protesters, that he would have been murdered by BLM protesters. This isn't just the fear that a reasonable man would have for his own life and safety. This is the absolute overwhelming statistical data that we have from the entire activity of that specific exact organization throughout that exact specific period of time. Get Good says I'd shoot somebody if they took my food. Yes, and yes. Shifty 10 Muscle says protesters is putting it lightly. Yeah, the correct word here is terrorists. What BLM has been engaged in for the last nearly 10 years is pure terrorism. From the Berkeley riots to the guy that ran up on the stage with a super soaker and hosed Michael Knowles down with some unknown chemicals, to the firebombing of the president's church on May 29th of 2020. It's pure terrorism. So, but the actual pardoning of Perry is not the service of justice, because the truth of the matter is he was still convicted by a jury of murder in a case where the evidence shows very clearly that Perry's only alternative to killing the man with the gun who was attacking him was to surrender and be killed himself. There is no compelling evidence which exists to suggest that Perry could have survived that incident in any other way. Right? There are self-defense cases where self-defense proves out, and the guy that pulled the trigger and won the draw is acquitted based on the other guy had a knife and strong language, where I totally support the outcome, right? Yes, the guy had a knife and strong language, and yes, that was good enough reason to put him down for your own safety. But let me tell you something. In that case, one can argue reasonably that one may have been able to draw the weapon, to draw the gun, dissuade the attacker with the knife, and come out the other end of that encounter without having to kill the guy and not having died yourself. Now, be clear. If somebody comes at you with a knife and you shoot him in the chest repeatedly so that you don't get stabbed, I am on your side 100%. It is possible to draw your weapon, dissuade the attacker, and survive that encounter without having to kill the attacker. My point here is that Perry was faced with a situation where there was not an outcome. There was no outcome that included both men living. There was no outcome where the man with the rifle and Perry both survived the encounter. And for that reason alone, Perry should have been acquitted. Plain and simple. So that's all I've got for you this morning. Thanks for watching, guys. We love you, and we will see you tomorrow. Y'all stay safe out there. Oh, hey, get good. Don't get it confused, brother. I'm going to return fire first, too. There's a knife coming at me, and I don't care if I might be able to talk him out of it. We're done. That was just an example of how, there is a significant bias toward leftist activists. The current justice system has a distinct and inarguable bias in favor of radical left-wing terrorism. They are pro-terrorism. That's the Justice Department, the FBI, and the police. They are pro-terrorism, as long as it's, abortionists and racists. So, y'all be safe. Love you.